Thank you so much, Tobias, and thank you to the CKN for allowing us to conduct this research, and to everyone who is taking some time in this second day of July to hear us blubber about our research. We greatly appreciate that. So without further ado, I would like to start presenting you the main framework and results for our research conducted in the last year for the CKN. The agenda of today looks like a lot, but we'll try to keep it short and sweet. I would like to first introduce you a little bit to the context behind which this project was born and carried out, before briefly touching upon the methodological, so the theoretical part that allowed us to explore the theme of Chinese interference in Dutch strategic industries, to then move on to the actual toolkit of Beijing when it comes to foreign interference, as well as the case studies. So we will take a deep dive into three industries, in particular semiconductor, maritime and aerospace sector, to talk about, well, is this interference there? To what level? And what is the impact? Should we be worried about it? And of course, as Tobias already said, this is an initiative geared towards the ministry, so we also have some policy recommendations to implement for the Dutch government, but also that I'm sure will give us the start of a promising Q&A later on. So let's start with the context that we conducted this research in. So we started from what we define as The Hague's China conundrum. So the fact that China is a major trading partner for the Netherlands and for the EU, as well as an extremely important geopolitical power that in the past decades have risen to challenge the dominant hegemony of the United States. However, in this rise, it has also become to be at odds, maybe, which is with what is our, as the Netherlands, security guarantor, the United States. At the same time, it is cannot be understated how China is a central player in the global economy, especially in the tech sector, and one player that the Netherlands cannot do without, especially when it comes to business. So The Hague finds itself at a conundrum of how to deal with China and how to make the most of what has been defined, as we all know, strategic rival at the EU level. It is both a strategic threat and a partner for the Netherlands. And it is not a novelty here in The Hague to speak about the intelligence that we get about China interfering in what are the most important sectors, some of the most important sectors of the Dutch economy, with the intelligence services that have increasingly warned policymakers in The Hague about Chinese interference into Dutch business. At the same time, there is little clarification, and this is in the nature of interference itself, about what does this tactic look like, what does it mean for the Dutch economy and national security. And this is all, again, in the cadre of Beijing extreme importance as a partner for the Netherlands when it comes to business and trade, and also in the development of those who are deemed to be cutting-edge technologies. So this report aimed at addressing this gap and looking into how the Netherlands can be aware of this foreign interference without overstating a threat, but also while making sure that there is actions undertaken to tackle what could result in long-term risks. To tackle this, we have come up with an interference chain. This is our theoretical frameworks built on the literature that we have examined over the course of several months to model what is the classic interference dynamic of Beijing. So the first step in the Chinese interference chain, which is a methodology applicable to other countries too, of course, it's motivation. The first question you have to ask yourself, we asked ourselves while conducting this research, is why would China be interested in interfering in these strategic industries? The second one is, okay, what are the entry points? Because when we talk about industry, it is not the same about talking about government. There are differences in the opportunities and in the entry points that China has to actually pursue interference. They go beyond the classical methods. And what are the likely interference scenario? What type of interference is China most likely to pursue in each industry? And lastly, of course, how intense is the risk of interference for each targeted industry? So this methodology takes from the broader literature on foreign interference and hybrid threats, but tailors it to the industry level, which is the novelty of the report too. And to assess the risk of interference, we use this extremely overwhelming table that you see on screen. And we do not expect you, of course, to read every single cell, but it is to give you an insight on the whole work that went into assessing the risk that Chinese interference poses to Dutch strategic industries. We evaluate risk as a combination of probability and impact, and for each of these two dimensions, we have measured several indicators that tell us how likely is China to interfere and how big the impact will be if it does so. I don't want to bore you too much with these details because I think the most important things and the most interesting things for us to discuss today are actually in conjunction with the Beijing interference toolkit and the case studies. So now I would like to give it on to Hans, which can take it from here and walk you through the Beijing interference toolkit. I don't think it works.
That's a good question if this works, but good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate everyone showing up in person and online. So I'm going to basically bring you guys through a little bit of the toolkit or mechanisms of how actually China is actually engaging in certain interference tactics. So the first one we're going to go through, of course, is, if I can get this one, there we go, economic statecraft. So I think this might be the most common or the most well-known in terms of the actual actions they go through. So I kind of give a little bit of an example. We go here. Everyone's very familiar, I think, I hope, at least with the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative. The idea that China is expanding its influence across the world by investing in a number of different ports throughout different countries. It's using its economic might and its money and its ability to a certain extent, streamline processes around the world to exert its influence. And the idea behind that is, as it exerts its influence, you become more dependent on that influence, and the idea that more counterintuitive voices or maybe dissident voices to that influence, to that idea, are then pushed back through the economic might. So I think there's a number of different examples. We highlight one in the idea that in Sri Lanka, for example, there was a port that was built by Chinese businesses. It was given a 99-year, it was basically built with the idea that they would pay it back. The Sri Lankan government had to default on that particular loan. They then basically gained control of the port, China, for somewhere between 99 to 100 years, based off the fact that they defaulted on their loan. That's a very, in a nutshell, an idea about some of the different kind of ways in which China has been able to use its economic powers and might to try and influence and try and push its own, in a way, soft power across different countries. So that was one of those ideas. And you can kind of see here right now is just the different places and the actual footprint of where China has influence, where it's actually invested in different ports. And these investments can range from anywhere from 5% to 45%, and in some places 100%. We have example, if you look here, you can even see one of the places highlighted, of course, is the port of Rotterdam, the Euromax, where Chinese companies, at least when this particular research was out, was about 45% kind of stake within the actual port itself. So we within the Netherlands are not actually too far away from this kind of pressure as well. That has decreased over the years, and there are kind of caveats that come along with that. But you can see that from a long-term strategic plan, we have seen continued sustained investment and kind of use of soft power even here in the Netherlands and Europe more broadly. So from there, we go into the digital information operations. Some people know this as FIMI, foreign interference in information manipulation. I'm we just happen to call it digital information operations for this particular case. But in the idea behind this essentially is as a more sexy way of saying cyber attacks, cyber information operations, in the idea that you can see Chinese operatives, Chinese hackers targeting specific strategic sectors with certain cyber attacks or other forms of information manipulation to gather information they can use strategically within their own sectors. So within the report ourselves, we did highlight, and we'll go into that in the case studies a little bit, the idea of targeting maritime, aerospace, and semiconductor. So we can see here that we can very much have a warning from our own government, from our own intelligence services, that those sectors are being targeted by these types of cyber attacks, these cyber espionage, the digital means in which to gather information to then build on top of their pre-existing infrastructure and their pre-existing knowledge base, use that to then gain strategic advantage within those sectors, to then make sure that they are on top of that industry, to make sure they can determine also the policies of how that industry goes. We talk about it a little bit in depth within the report itself, and I don't want to go too much into it right now, but essentially these policies build on frameworks such as the Made in China 2025 policy, you have the China Standard 2035 policy, you have the 5-year plans that are being put out where they list the strategic sectors, and you can see if you build on top of them, there's a bit of a pyramid effect where China Standard basically builds on top of the previous ones, where they want you to then basically gather information, gather the people, use that to then become equal to our Western competitors. And the China Standard says we then no longer want to be equal, we want to be guiding the industry, we want to be guiding how the industries are going in that particular way. So you can see the kind of pyramid effect from here, and this is just one tool in which they do that, so that we go into a little bit. And we'll go into a little bit more about how they're targeted between the sectors, how the extent to which the actual impact of that, because you have to remember that to a certain extent within the case studies, we also noted that China is already ahead in certain industries and they don't need to do this as much. So again, we'll get into that into the case studies. From there, we have physical interference. From a Europe perspective and from a Netherlands perspective, it's the least useful and potentially the least prevalent. We've heard a lot of instances about South China Sea, building of kind of the idea of man-made islands. We've seen them interfering within naval chains, things like that within Asia, in the Netherlands particularly. Doesn't happen as much. We've heard about the idea of in the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, there's a potential of cable cuttings, unconfirmed. But these are kind of the ideas you see when you see physical interference, and the idea that they're using, I don't like using the word shadow fleet because it's a little overplayed, and there's an idea behind shadow fleets where it's informal chains. But for lack of a better term, shadow fleets from China that are using coast guards or from fishing vessels that are linked to companies registered in Hong Kong or registered in China themselves, or even Singapore to a certain extent, then crossing over kind of shipping lanes and then cutting cables, allegedly, again, not confirmed yet, and that being used to either form or express political grievances, or being used in preparation for testing the boundaries of what countries like the Netherlands or in Europe are actually able to respond to and how quickly we respond to these things. So again, within the Dutch context, is not as prevalent, and it poses a slightly lesser threat, and we kind of showed that throughout the report as well. But it is important to know that that is a mechanism that exists, and that is a scenario that we will have to prepare for if geopolitical tensions do escalate to a certain extent within I would say 10 years, 20 years, depending on how the scenario goes, of course, around Taiwan and other kind of geopolitical flashpoints. The last one, and I will preface that I will go into a little bit less detail about this one just because we have recently published a report on this where we go into much more detail about what that is, published and authored by Benedetta herself. But the idea behind legal pressure is that China uses and it's very closely linked to our first lever, our first mechanism, with the idea that companies that want to do business in China, companies that are doing business in China, are very adherent to the Chinese legal system. There's a lot of pressure they can exert in that way for dissident voices. The idea that if you want to continue to operate in China, you want to continue to operate easily within the Chinese market, you have to kind of play ball in the way that Beijing and the People's Republic want you to do that. So again, I won't go too into depth in that one, but I will say read the report. It's very good and it's worth the read. So if you want to learn more about this particular aspect, we have this for you guys. And the last one is, and apologies for the non-Dutch speakers, is the best one I could find for that particular example, but essentially talent-based technological espionage. So this is, from an intelligence perspective, much more kind of the human intelligence gathering people who are willing to spill secrets from businesses to help in the process of information acquisition. So you can view this very closely related to the cyber espionage angle. This is much more, we find people within industries, within businesses that are maybe disgruntled, feel like they're not being paid enough, not being appreciated enough, or there's also the possibility of people who are from Chinese diaspora, who have families still left in China. There are countless examples of people who are then being blackmailed into saying, we will make your family's life in China incredibly hard if you not play ball and help us gather information. These ones, you would think this would be the idea of they take information and they leave. There's also the possibility of them saying, stay in this company for a number of years, keep on feeding us information over 3-4 years, and then when you come to China, or when you come back to China, depending on your origin of your origin, you can basically then have a very nice cushy position at one of our Chinese companies, our competitors for the place you just stole. So in this particular case, we can see that a former ASML employee stole information, went back to China, and then he was basically essentially given a position at a Chinese competitor of ASML. There's countless examples of that. In 2013, 2 former Chinese employees of ASML also stole information and then started their own semiconductor company in China with the support of Beijing. I could go on. There's a lot of examples of these across the world, but I think this one particularly is the most prudent. And you can see that a lot of this is connected to not necessarily immediately hurting the Dutch economy, but it's very much targeted at the long-term benefit of building up on the Chinese economy, building it up to the point where it's no longer having to rely on foreign supply chains and foreign information to continue to compete. And that was the last one, and we'll go a little bit more detail into the case studies, but I'll give Benedetta that.
Thank you, Hans. We're doing a bit of tag teaming here, so we keep the attention high by switching the voices here. But Hans perfectly illustrated all the different tools that Beijing has at its disposal to interfere in industry. Again, the focus here is on the industry side, is on the private sector side of things. So once we have an idea, and we're all on the same page now of this toolkit, it is important to apply it. So we chose 3 case studies: semiconductor, maritime, and aerospace industry. These were industry that are not only fundamental to the Dutch economy, but already flagged by a report from the NVD and by former Minister of Defense Brokkelmans as industries in which we have witnessed here at the Dutch level Chinese interference. So we decided to take the plunge with the blessing of CKN and try to look a little deeper into how China applies this toolkit to these 3 specific industries. Starting, probably to nobody's surprise, with the semiconductor industry. So we chose these case studies because, of course, the Netherlands is in a very advanced position in the supply chain of semiconductor, not only because of ASML, but also because of the whole high-tech ecosystem developed around semiconductors in Eindhoven, but especially because the Netherlands is in a position to have some technology that Beijing would like to recreate, if anything. So we applied our methodology to the semiconductor supply chain sector. So as mentioned before, we start with asking ourselves why. And why would China want to apply all of the tactics that Hans has just talked about to the semiconductor sector? And in a nutshell, the reply is because China is building toward self-reliance when it comes to the semiconductor supply chain that we know being an extremely interconnected and globalized supply chain, but also one that is extremely important in the context of great power competition between the US and China, as well as something that China has declared in its strategies to be of national security importance. Last but not least, the semiconductor sectors also plays a role into Chinese plan for a unification with the island of Taiwan. We could go into a full separate report about just this last point, but having prominence in the semiconductor supply chain is really seen as a matter of national security to the PRC, and the Netherlands with ASML occupies an important spot in the supply chains since ASML has the monopoly when it comes to advanced EUV machines. Additionally, other Dutch companies such as NXP also are innovators in the field and producers of semiconductors that are important to the full ecosystems. So the why is pretty clear. And then we asked ourselves, okay, where are the weak spots that in the Dutch semiconductor sector that the PRC might exploit to perform this interference? And we found that, in particular, the concentration of expertise and the proprietary nature of the semiconductor technologies are a good first entry point for China, as well as the leverage that the PRC has when it comes to critical raw materials, in particular gallium, germanium, and silicon, either for mining or processing. Those are materials that are fundamental to the manufacturing of semiconductor and of components that ASML's machine use. And this is where Beijing has leverage, has an entry point. So then, okay, this is the why, and this is the where. What about the how? What of these tactics that Hans just described could China leverage, particularly in the semiconductor supply chains? Well, as Hans already kind of spoiled before, talent-based espionage is a real risk when it comes to the semiconductor sector, as well as digital and information operation. A lot of the IP and a lot of the engineering is, of course, made through digital means. And last but not least, economic statecraft, and I already told you why, because of the leverage that Beijing has on critical raw materials and other leverage point throughout the semiconductor supply chain, as well as, of course, the tight economic bonds between the Netherlands and China. So we took all of this information and we plotted it to get to the strategic risk that the semiconductor supply chain incurs. And again, the report contains many more details on each of all these different steps, but I don't want to keep you hostage until like 7 p.m. tonight. So I'm just going to skip and tell you that, unsurprisingly, the semiconductor is actually at very high risk of interference, both in terms of impact and probability, because it has high strategic relevance and also quite the history of targeting, as well as some sector-specific vulnerabilities that make it an interesting interference point for China. It is, however, relatively moderately accessible, and this is because, of course, is a very protected industry from the Dutch government. There are all, and the individual firms, there are already protections in place. However, because of the importance at the economic, technological, supply chain and security level for the Netherlands, we also judged, assessed, and again, we collected indicators and numbers for all of this, a high impact on Dutch national security and economic prosperity. So the gaps in particular that we estimated to be current present on the Dutch policy side are a fragmented implementation of sector-wide protective measures. The implementation still differs very much from company to company because there's no national directive on how to protect specifically the semiconductor sector from this specific type of interference. Controversially, but there are still no export control covering human-enabled technology transfer. It's a very difficult area to tackle, but it remains a gap when we talk about Chinese interference. And lastly, there is a lack of oversight on the government side for long-term access, as well as majority stake, supplier dependencies, or evolving risk profiles. And a funny anecdote is that we were in the middle of this research when the Nexperia case exploded here at the Dutch level. So we saw some of this vulnerability playing out on our eyes. And we also partially based ourselves on the, back then and still, ongoing Nexperia case to come up with some sector-specific policy actions for the Dutch government to protect their semiconductor sector from Chinese interference. In particular, reinforce investment screenings, developing a continuity instruction at the national level, institutes AI-enabled IP protection standards, a point for discussion, introducing certifications and strengthen personnel vetting. Again, many more details into the report, but what is important to remember is that due to the importance of the sector for both the Netherlands and China, as well as the impact, this is a highly disruptible sector, should China be successful in implementing its interference tactics. Hans, I'll leave it to you, and we need to keep it short.
Yes, just looking at the time, I'll try and go with this a little bit quicker. I had mentioned earlier, essentially, that there are some cases where China had a little bit of a more nuanced approach towards a lot of these industries, and maritime is one of them. Beyond the fact that maritime by itself is a quite broad sector within the Netherlands, going from things like our ports all the way down to our shipbuilders, like a Damen, you can see that to a certain extent we saw the interest in these particular industries differently. So, as I said, I'll start off with what we did. So we have economic power projection, access to European and NATO logistics, and intelligence gathering. Each of these actually had very different purposes within the maritime sector. So economic power projection and access to the European and NATO logistics, that's very much looking at our ports. That's looking at where our particular troops are located, looking at being able to monitor where NATO and European troops are going throughout these different ports, throughout the European platform, and of course, within the Netherlands. And then intelligence gathering, interesting enough, that can be for both. That can be both our shipbuilders and for our ports. And I'll go into a little bit what I mean by that. So the entry ports, of course, we noted a little bit earlier when I was talking about economic statecraft, that partial ownership of port infrastructure, digitalization of the ports and stuff like that, these are the entering points. Where does China have the power? Where does it have the influence? It's in money and it's in technology. So those are the ways where you can see that they're basically integrating themselves into our port infrastructure, and we're more than happy in a lot of cases to take on cheaper technology that's easier to use to a certain extent. And then collaboration with Chinese suppliers. This then comes down to both our ports and to our shipbuilding. Shipbuilders within the Netherlands are very happy it's one of our biggest markets. We have to be able to use access to maintain access, and that to a certain extent means that we have to do work with Chinese suppliers when we're building ships in China or when we're operating within the Chinese market. It creates a bit of a strategic incentive where when we're operating there, how do we close off our access? Do we make sure that we're not maintaining our infrastructure on both the Dutch side and the Chinese side? That it brings a lot of questions where we can see the interference scenarios of digital information operations. Are we leaving ourselves open to cyber espionage, to cyber attacks? Are we leaving our infrastructure open for interference, and so forth? And I'll kind of go through this a little bit quicker, but the idea behind here very much is that maritime has different aspects because China is already so far ahead when it comes to things like producing ships. They can produce 20 to 25 ships a year compared to our 10s. And in the US, that's 2 ships a year compared to their 2025. So they don't need help trying to build better ships. They don't need help trying to then improve their processes. What they do need to know is how far we are with our processes. They need to know how quickly we are improving our infrastructure, how quickly we're improving our processes, how quickly we are developing our economy, or in particular the sectors of maritime. And then when it comes to shipbuilding, when it comes to port infrastructure, that's a different story. They want to know, again, intelligence gathering, looking at our troops, making sure that they're integrated into our infrastructure to make sure that we're reliant on them from an economic standpoint. So there's very different and a very broad spectrum of interests and needs when it comes to the maritime sector. And it's not as black and white as I think some people expected it to be. And then, of course, I'll go into the strategic relevance. We can see very much that there is a very high impact. There is a high risk, but it, again, depends. We can see that technologically, they're not really stealing information from us. They're not stealing technology from us, but they're trying to integrate it. You can see from targeting, there is targeting. We can see that that has some strategic value depending on the angle we look at within the maritime sector. And you can see that there's concerns about supply chains, et cetera. I think just for interest of time, we'll go through the policy recommendations later at the end because we do have a whole kind of slide dedicated to that. But it's important to know that for a lot of cases, this is just a lot of this is caused by uneven business interests and uneven application of things like cybersecurity, air gapping, et cetera, that leaves us vulnerable to a lot of these digital information operations, or more specifically also statecraft and legal pressure as well when you're operating in China. So there's these issues and kind of boundaries and pushing and pulls there that are important to keep in mind when you're talking about maritime, because it isn't one monolith. It's very much a spectrum of different interests and different economic purposes. So I'll go on to...
Last but very least, I promise, our third case study on the aerospace sector. And this is interesting because this is a technology, especially when it comes to satellite development, that China is still interested in ameliorating, getting better at when it comes to its own production capabilities of this cutting edge technology. However, it is a less exposed industry when it comes to the Netherlands. First of all, because it does not have, the Netherlands does not have the same positioning in the aerospace sector that it has, for example, in the maritime and even more semiconductor sector. But still, China is lagging somewhat in the innovation in the aerospace sector, actually, especially when it comes to satellite, where the Dutch have some very advanced IP. So it's more about the IP and less about the manufacturing. And we know that China is currently striving to develop anti-satellite weapons, the famous ASATs that we hear a lot of since the war in Ukraine. And the fact that the higher Dutch yield for China, it is concentrated at actually the university level, which is interesting given this presentation from Wijnhaven, also means that talent acquisition and the exploitation of the Dutch knowledge environment becomes really central when we look at interference in this sector here in the Netherlands. And the way, I know there are experts in the room that have written about this, but the way that the PRC is able to also infiltrate the knowledge communities here in the Netherlands is an important entry point for the aerospace sector. So it is not sci-fi to affirm that the most likely interference scenarios revolve around digital and information operation, as well as talent-based technology transfer, some economic coercion, because some of the manufacturing depends on the critical raw materials coming from China. There are some gaps here in the way the Dutch government has so far operated in protecting its aerospace sector. In particular, there are no vertical baseline resilience measure, and there are gaps in the protection of sensitive data and academic partnerships. Many of Dutch universities that still that have important developments for the aerospace sector, such as TU Delft, still have close partnerships with Chinese universities, which is not per se bad, but there is little control over the exchange of this partnership. Report of 2019 of our very own Leiden Asia Center did highlight how this kind of academic partnership represents a risk when it comes to industrial espionage. And however, this industry, we found out, is less at risk with respect to the semiconductor and the maritime industry. The importance of the aerospace sector is more limited for the Dutch economy with respect to others, as well as the probability of disruption is lower because it is more an protected environment that revolves around IP, for which here in Europe we have some protection already in place. However, it is interesting to notice that when it comes to technological leaks, that's where the major impact of Chinese interference might be in the interference sector. We kind of went a bit faster through the case studies, but there are important differences in the importance of these sectors for the Dutch economy and national security, as well as in the way China interferes via economic or digital versus talent acquisitions, All of the details of the 3 case studies are contained in the report, which will soon be published. We invite you to read, but we still think it's important to close it off to have some concrete implication of these case studies for Dutch national security. And we came to 3 consequences of interference and 5 recommendations that we'll quickly go through. The 3 major consequences, very important, it's something that observing the 3 case studies we can conclude, is that there are systemic challenges to national security that come through China interference. It is not a collection of isolated incidents, but the PRC systemically uses interference in strategic industry, so not just at a government level. This has an impact of the Netherlands' ambitions when it comes to strategic autonomy and the very own governance model of the Netherlands, who has relied on liberally and less regulated trade for the past decades. The second consequences and conclusion is that Chinese interference actually erodes the resilience that the Netherlands is trying to build at the industry level, as well as decision making. This is because it targets critical sector and it exploits, again, the very form of the Netherlands when it comes to openness of trade. And it's not a coincidence that I think also as a result of the Nexperia case, we see the Dutch government already taking more steps to be in contact with the private sector and regulate this liberality. Last but not least, consequences of this systemic action is also that we need in the Netherlands a resilience-focused response, a response that helps us tackling this interference, on the one hand, in cooperation with the private sector by involving the industry in the dialogue, on the other hand, without overstating the problem and without making it a matter of public panic. So let's analyze it, let's tackle it without making a loud noise that might only run into further consequences. And we have a few ideas of how to do this that I'll briefly let Hans conclude on. If you want to go for this. Definitely prepared.
Yeah. No, I mean, we'll go through this. I also want to leave time for questions, Q&A, because I think that's going to be the interesting part as well. So I'll go through this quite briefly. But our number one is basically establish a national coordination and intelligence sharing architecture. It's not enough for the MIFID, the IFID, and our different kind of intelligence agencies and intelligence kind of operations to gather this in a silo. There needs to be some level of sharing between them, industry, and the ministries. I think there's a lot of information here. This is one of those kind of platforms where we can talk about this, and it needs to be a little bit more open. Second one, of course, is implement mandatory risk-based sector-wide security standards. It's a mouthful, but essentially the idea is that we've had conversations about this, but the idea of we need to do screening. We talked particularly about our kind of knowledge institutes, our universities. We talked about having this a couple of years ago about implementing more stringent screening on researchers, PhD students, professors, et cetera. But that needs to be a conversation we have again, because essentially we are seeing leaks coming from there, and there needs to be an understanding of where these people are coming for. And I understand that part of the problem that came from there is who does the screening? Does the Ministry of Justice or does our intelligence services have the capacity to do that? There may need to be a separate kind of organization or organ that needs to be set up to do this, because it will require hundreds, if not thousands of people. And it needs to not be unilateral. It can't be just one set standard. We can't treat bachelor students and master students like PhD students and professors. They all have different risk profiles. They all have different things. They have different access to information. They're doing different research. So there needs to be a tiered system to understand where these risks are and where they're coming from, which should alleviate some of the capacity concerns that come from governments, but it also should ensure we're not leaving holes and leaving ourselves vulnerable to a certain extent. We go into that in more detail in the report itself. So if you're interested, we can talk about it afterwards, or we can talk about it, it's in the report as well. So embedded foreign interference risk into industrial and innovation policy. So again, this is kind of the idea behind establishing a public-private cooperation in terms of funding, in terms of knowledge sharing, things like this, to make sure that both government and the industry are aware of what's going on, and that they can kind of ask questions, and there's funding for looking into these things where possible. again, that this is one of those things we'll go in a little bit more detail about how that differentiates from other things. Promote transparency, accountability, international alignment. So essentially the idea that there needs to be regular assessment and we need to be not doing this in a silo. If there's something we've kind of learned from our conversations with conversations about interoperability and military mobility, things like that we've had over the last couple of years, is we can't do this in a silo. The Netherlands can't be looking at only our own information sharing, our own information kind of knowledge base. We need to be doing this in cooperation with our partners in EU and NATO. And there needs to be a little bit more standard and coordination in how we do this, because it's great for us to be doing, for example, to be shutting off kind of sensitive topics to Chinese researchers or people who are maybe associated with the PRC. But if we're still cooperating with our Spanish partners or our French partners and they're cooperating with these researchers who are doing this, there's still a possibility of information leak. So there needs to be more coordination on that front. And then lastly, strategically maintain interdependence through selective, reciprocal, and leverage-based engagement. And this is a very mouthy way of basically saying that we need to be able to ensure that we are, as the Netherlands, we have our own economic strengths. We have things that we're good at. We show it in the report. We can't always assume that we're on the back foot on these things. We can flex our muscles a little bit when it comes to our own economic importance and to our own industries. We need to be able to be willing to flex our own muscles and not just accept the status quo and accept things as they are. We need to be able to move forward in a way that both protects ourselves, but also doesn't endanger our relationship with an important partner like China. There is a balance there. There's a dance, and it is one that's very fine line. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I know that we're making it sound very easy right now, but it is a conversation to have, and it is something we need to at least go into with the idea of let's not just accept what's happening. We need to be able to exert our will to a certain extent. So, and that's the last of them. I think that's Q&A after that. So, thank you guys very much.